So we've talked about how it works. Hopefully I've managed to give some understanding around the basics of the thing without being too technical. The second part of today is around regulatory issues. So what are the regulatory issues around HVAC? I mentioned before the built environment is one of the more regulated industries that in the country. Most of the regulations are very much around health and safety and environment, environment being relatively late comer to that field. So let's have a quick look at each of these. Essential safety measures, building regulations in general safety, a thing called CBD neighbours, and the refrigerant phase-out program. So at the pointy end, we've got law. And with a lot of the regulations, the responsibility ultimately sits with the owner, even though we may, by way of history or by way of contract, seek to delegate that down to property managers, facilities managers, or even maintainers. Ultimately, in law, a lot of the legislation sits with the owners as such. Essential safety measures legislation, it's called different things in different states, is effectively ensuring that the HVAC will work when it's required to, principally in fire mode. And so if you've got a ventilation system which is part of your air conditioning system and it needs to work when the building's in fire mode to extract smoke from the space so that people can get out safely, you need to be able to maintain the system and demonstrate that you've maintained the system such that it will be operable in fire mode. And so there's a whole lot of legislation around all of that. It's all about attendance, it's all about evidence of that, and obviously there's an annual sign-off that many of you will be familiar with as well. The other aspect is cooling towers. Since the year 2000, certainly in Victoria was eluded because of the issues at the aquarium. We've got a lot of legislation around the requirement to maintain, to manage, and to report on all of that with cooling towers. And that's all driven by a public health risk. Building regulations are effectively the requirements around design and construction, and to some extent maintenance in buildings. It sets up standards of construction. So if you're doing retrofits, if you're doing replacements, you'll find that the devices that you buy, whether they be cooling towers or fan coil units or what have you, will have some impact from building regulations. They talk about minimum fresh air and ventilation standards. They talk about minimum levels of maintenance. Obviously, when you get to systems like electrical systems, plumbing systems, you've got the requirement to use licensed contractors and for these things to be done to a certain standard. There is a whole regime around all of that, and using licensed providers obviously means that there's a cost imposed on the industry accordingly. Refrigerants are looked upon as a controlled substance. They're ozone depleting. They also have a global warming potential, and so they're a controlled substance. So our organisation has a licence to buy and install and manage refrigerants, and we need to be we're audited every year and what have you, so there's a real legislative framework around refrigerants as such. Safety is a challenge for all of us these days, certainly in buildings. Again, that responsibility to occupants, including visitors, also including contractors. Also in terms of maintenance providers, we're all employers. So whether you're a property manager or a maintenance contractor, you need to provide a safe workplace for all your employees. So there's a whole lot of emphasis around a duty of care to a safe environment. You've got a range of regulations around all that. There's all sorts of challenges when you come to change buildings. Anybody that's been in some of the major city buildings undergoing a retrofit whilst the thing's still partly occupied, you can see some of the challenges around safety with all of that. As the industry becomes more aware of safety, and different organisations get their own safety systems up, we're seeing a fair bit of, I suppose, meshing of processes and procedures in the built environment at the moment. Everybody's keen to have their own systems applied, and that's obviously adding an overall cost. At the end of the day, you also have a joint and several responsibility around safety, which we often forget. So as individuals, you have a responsibility, a fundamental responsibility for our own safety. Obviously, systems and procedures and what have you need to be in place. But quite often, with the focus on safety, we forget that individuals have a responsibility as well. But a big thing in buildings, and increasingly so. I mentioned before the Commercial Building Disclosure Program and neighbours. A couple of years ago, the Commonwealth put legislation in place that made it mandatory that if you were to lease or sell commercial space above 2,000 square metres, in that sale or lease process you needed to disclose its energy efficiency by way of its neighbours rating. So in some ways, more or less, a mandated neighbours rating. Now obviously there are a whole range of overheads associated with getting a neighbours running and what you do with all that once you get it. And obviously once you get it, you want to keep it. So that adds a little bit of focus back onto maintenance and HVAC and what have you as well. But another regulatory overhead that comes around buildings, which is relatively new. I also talked about refrigerant phase out, which has been a little bit of the sleeping giant in the background. Some legislation has a very long tail. The Montreal Protocol was put in place in 1996 and talked about the phase out of ozone depleting gases. And so those of you that have been in buildings long enough will remember the phasing out of chillers that ran on R11 and R12. We've now got to the point where in 2016 there will be no importation of R22. And R22 is a refrigerant gas which is used in just about everything other than big chillers up until relatively recently. So it's everywhere. Older split units, small part load chillers, small DX systems all have R22 in them. So 2016 is an interesting date, but it's not the important phenomenon. The important phenomenon is that manufacturers stopped making devices for R22 some time ago, so parts are getting scarce. And because you can't import R22 or manufacture R22, R22 is getting scarce. So what you're really looking at now is an economic phase out as such. 6 years ago, R22, a kilo of R22, and bear in mind a small chiller might have 100 kilos of R22 in it. 6 years ago, a kilo of R22 was worth about $20. Today, the retail rate's about $330 a kilo, and it's only going one way, if you can get it. In a few years' time, you'll struggle with availability and you'll be paying well over $1,000 a kilo for this stuff. So you lose a kilo this month and your monthly service costs you $500. A kilo of refrigerant costs you $1,000. So it's causing people to look at their old plant. You know, the good news is a lot of this kit's sort of 10, 15 years old, so it's coming to the end of its life cycle. But refrigerant's a real issue, and R22 is everywhere.